Please be seated. It is my honor to give the Christopher B. Nelson Lecture tonight. Mr. Nelson is an alum of the college and was president of St. John's College in Annapolis beginning in 1991. His presidency was marked by consistent care for our community of learning and lasted for more than 25 years, a remarkably long tenure for a college president. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you all to the question period after lecture to be held in the conversation room. We call it the question period rather than the question and answer period for a reason, so adjust your expectations accordingly. By tradition, the students are allowed to ask the first few questions. All right. In a few weeks, the freshmen will be reading William Harvey's account of the circulation of the blood and the motion of the heart. Published in 1628, De Motu Cordis details the painstaking experiments and observations made by Harvey in order to tease out the motion of the heart and the blood. He outlines the framework of what any middle school biology student would recognize as the circulatory system. The heart contracts, producing the characteristic beat, squeezing the blood out of the heart through the arteries to either the lungs or the extremities of the body. The blood then returns to the heart through the veins, empties into the auricles, only to be squeezed out again at the next heartbeat. Harvey is very clear that the heartbeat is produced at the squeeze of the heart, at systole in his language, and not at diastole, the subsequent relaxation and expansion of the heart. In a few months, our sophomores will be reading René Descartes' 1632 work, Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting the Reason and Seeking Truth in the Sciences. What is sometimes skimmed over in this dense work is Descartes' own account in the fifth part of the motion of the heart and the blood. He uses the heart as an example of what can be accomplished when reason is correctly used in the study of living bodies. As described by Descartes in the Discourse, and again in other works of his, the heartbeat is the result of a kind of explosion of the blood into vapor as it enters the very hot heart. The sudden increase in the volume of the heart causes the walls of the heart to expand out, hitting the chest and producing the beat we feel. As the blood cools, it reliquefies and flows out to circulate through the body. In the Discourse, Descartes credits Harvey for establishing the circulation of the blood and gives him praise. What is not explicitly stated, though, is that Descartes' account of the motion of the heart is completely different from Harvey's. In the words of one of my former students, Descartes' heart is an internal combustion engine running on blood instead of gasoline. It is easy to miss this fact while reading the Discourse, though, because Descartes' rhetoric emphasizes his agreement with Harvey in the matter of the circulation of the blood, rather than his stark disagreement regarding the motion of the heart and the cause of the heartbeat. With the benefit of hindsight and later studies, we might be tempted to write off Descartes' account of the motion of the heart as a simple mistake. Harvey, after all, writes eloquently about the difficulty of understanding the motion of the heart. Quote, "I found the task so truly arduous, so full of difficulties," he says, "that I was almost tempted to think that the motion of the heart was only to be comprehended by God." Harvey's observations were just better than Descartes', we might think. Harvey got it right, Descartes got it wrong. At one level, this is true. After all, there are some questions for which an answer can be determined empirically, and it is the case that Harvey's account of the heartbeat has been confirmed by subsequent study, while Descartes' account has not. If we stop for a moment to dwell on the matter, though, we might find occasion for wonder. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that Descartes possessed one of the greatest minds of any human being who has ever lived. He had read Harvey's account, in which Harvey gives very explicit instructions for how to verify the fact that the heart beats at systole as a squeeze, rather than at diastole as an expansion. Descartes was clearly quite familiar with animal bodies. He gives his own observations of arteries, valves, and veins in great anatomical detail. He was clearly capable then of reading Harvey, understanding his account, and performing the requisite observations for verification. Yet Descartes insists on his own incorrect account of the heart's motion. In fact, he holds to his account, not only in the discourses, but also in later letters to a correspondent, the philosopher and mathematician Marin Mersenne. In this lecture, we will begin with this question: how can two people observing the same phenomena come to such different accounts? We'll then move to the question, what is the heart doing, by delving into a more contemporary account of the action of the heartbeat in part 2. Finally, in part 3, we'll reflect on how our account of how the heart works affects our ideas of what living beings are. Part 1, Harvey and Descartes. Before Harvey's time, the accepted account of the heart, largely formulated by Galen, was as a partner to respiration. The heart was thought to open up with a thump at the heartbeat, sucking a bit of blood into itself, and then to relax, allowing some blood to dribble out. In this idea of the heartbeat, the blood moves slowly in and out of the heart and arteries like the tides of an estuary. And here is Galen's idea. So at diastole, the heart kind of opens up, and then the blood kind of dribbles in, and then heart kind of just eases back down, and the blood kind of dribbles out. An analogy to this pre-Harvey understanding might be found in a drinking straw, which is why I call this idea the sipping straw heartbeat. The heart drawing blood in can be thought of as like what happens when the mouth contracts, leading to a sharp intake of liquid through a straw. The relaxation in between beats would be as when the mouth relaxes after sipping and the liquid dribbles out, leaving backwash in the cup. There is no reason a priori why this account would not be correct. It is perfectly logical. As Harvey tells it, the sipping straw heartbeat was completely accepted by anyone and everyone who was a serious thinker at the time. He had his work cut out for him. Accordingly, in De Motu Cordis, after expressing just how difficult it was for him to come to understand the motion of the heart, Harvey cites numerous experiments and observations, inviting the reader to make the same observations to corroborate his revolutionary idea of how the heart moves. He describes the shape and color of the heart upon contraction. The apex rises and the heart becomes pale. The formation of the muscle fibers of the heart from apex to base, but also encircling the ventricles, so as to bring the walls of the ventricles together upon contraction, and what happens to the heart as it slows and then ceases to beat. So here is Harvey's squeezing heartbeat. Blood flows in, and then squeeze at systole. The vivid image he gives is of a heart that is formed to squeeze, with a structure like other muscles that changes shape as it contracts. And I'll call Harvey's account of how the heart beats the squeezing heartbeat. Rather than opening up the insides, though, as the mouth does when sipping from a straw, the heart closes up completely, leaving precious little space for any blood to stay inside. So in both accounts, there's a kind of working, but in the Harvey account, the working is in the squeeze and not in the other part, in the opening up. Instead of the image of the sipping from a straw, one might think of a juice box that is squeezed, forcing the liquid out of the straw. Harvey adds to his initial observations by describing the loss of color in the heart upon beating, and by describing cutting open a ventricle to watch the blood being expelled during the beat. Harvey goes further to investigate where the heartbeat begins by watching it as it slows and stops. The motion of the heart is composed of at least two parts, and these distinct movements become more clear in a slowly beating heart. He sees the ventricles stop beating, even as the auricles, what we would call the atria today, continue in their beat. In particular, the right auricle is the last part of the heart to continue its motion as the heart ceases to beat. Through meticulous observations, Harvey comes to see that the auricles of the heart are, quote, the first part to live, the last to die. By live and die here, he seems to mean move and rest. He is likely following Aristotle's formulation that living things have the principle of motion and rest within themselves. If so, Harvey locates that principle in large part in the right auricle. Once the auricle starts the beat, the rest of the heart responds, spurring on the motion of the blood with every squeeze. Among the many people who responded to Harvey's book was the French philosopher René Descartes. He commented on the work in personal letters as early as 4 years after its publication in 1632. 5 years later, in 1637, he published his discourse, in which he gives his own account of the motion of the heart and of circulation, the account which I outlined at the beginning of the lecture. He later confirms his belief in this account in personal letters, as well as in other philosophical works. So here is Harvey. The blood comes in, boom, explodes into vapor, pushes the walls of the heart out, and then it kind of like slowly collapses down. So let's take a closer look at his account, which I will call the explosive heartbeat. Like Harvey, in the discourse, Descartes appeals to experience, calling on the reader to look at the structure of the heart, arteries, and veins, and to feel the heat of the heart. Though he and Harvey are looking at the same things, his account of how the heart beats bears little resemblance to Harvey's. According to Descartes, quote, as soon as these portions of blood enter the heart, they become rarefied and expand because of the heat there. This dilates the whole heart. A moment later, the heart and these arteries are all deflated because the blood which has entered them has cooled. Descartes had never seen anything like an internal combustion engine, of course, yet his description of how the heart beats is eerily similar to how an engine works, as my former student noticed. In the basic theory of how an engine works, gasoline enters the piston chamber or cylinder, where it encounters a spark plug. The gasoline ignited by a spark vaporizes explosively, expanding and pushing the mobile piston out towards the bottom of the cylinder and moving the cam, which transfers the explosive motion of the piston to rotation that can be used for work. The rotating cam moves whatever's connected to it, for instance, the wheels on an automobile. If you mentally replace the gasoline with blood, the spark with the intense heat of the heart, and the pistons with the walls of the ventricles, you will have the essence of Descartes' explosive heartbeat. This explosive beat bears some resemblance to the sipping straw heartbeat of Galen, in that the beat is felt upon the expansion of the heart. Unlike the sipping straw model, though, the blood is not drawn in by the activity of the heart muscles expanding, but rather the blood, upon hitting the heated heart, forces the heart to expand by its rapid vaporization. This rapid expansion then draws in more blood, which again vaporizes, perpetuating the cycle. Descartes agreed with Harvey's account of the circulation of blood around the body, but envisions circulation beginning with a bang, so to speak, rather than a squeeze. Like Harvey, Descartes appeals to observations that others can perform in order to persuade the reader. He says, quote, the motion, which I have just explained, follows necessarily from the mere disposition of the parts of the heart visible to the naked eye, from the heat which one can feel with the fingers, and from the nature of the blood, which one can learn by experiment, just as the motions of a clock follow from the weight, location, and configuration of its counterweights and wheels. For Descartes, the heartbeat is a necessity that follows from the physical response of liquid blood to high heat and the pliability of the heart, which expands in response to the pressure of the vaporizing blood. If the heart were less pliable, it might literally explode from the rapid expansion of the blood. Descartes' invocation of the clock is no offhand comment. Just as the spring-driven clock he would have been familiar with is constrained by physical necessity to move in the way it does, based on the form of its wheels and gears which are connected to the wound-up spring, the heart is constrained to beat by the effect of its own heat on the blood. The movement of the blood is then the result of the relaxation of the heart muscle. Let's pause for a moment and ask our question again. How can two people observing the same phenomena come to two completely different accounts? I suggest that the account you give of the phenomena you see depends upon what it is you think you are looking at. For example, when I observe and describe the motion of a rolling ball, my account will change greatly if I have been told beforehand that there is a running hamster inside. What is it that Harvey and Descartes think they are looking at? To answer this question, it will be instructive to pay attention to the metaphors each author uses to describe the heart's motion. For Harvey, probably the most essential metaphor he uses is the sun. In the dedicatory letter of De Motu Cordis to King Charles I of England, Harvey writes, quote, "The animal's heart is the basis of its life, its chief member, the sun of its microcosm. On the heart, all its activity depends. From the heart, all its liveliness and strength arise." Later in chapter 8, he invokes the image of the sun again and goes further. "The heart deserves to be styled the starting point of life and the sun of our microcosm, just as much as the sun deserves to be called the heart of the world. For it is by the heart's vigorous beat that the blood is moved, perfected, activated, and protected from injury and coagulation. The heart is the tutelary deity of the body, the basis of life, the source of all things, carrying out its function of nourishing, warming, and activating the body as a whole." To our postmodern ears, the language of sun to our microcosm sounds flowery and quaint. The language of tutelary deity simply sounds bizarre. What is he getting at? Let's examine each of these metaphors. First, what could he mean by using the metaphor of the sun? The sun gives the earth light and heat. Plants grow because of it, which means that all life depends on it. If the sun were suddenly to stop shining, all life on earth would soon die. The sun is not itself of the earth, but it is connected to the earth and provides the impetus for things on earth to happen. The cosmos, the ordered whole, would not remain ordered without the sun's light and heat. If the heart, as Harvey says, is the sun to our microcosm, the mini cosmos of our bodies, it must mean that he sees the heart as providing the impetus for life in the body. Recall his language. On the heart, all the body's activity depends. From the heart, all its liveliness and strength arise. There is something irreducibly other about the heart, something fundamental. The heart, by being the first thing in the body to move, and by moving and perfecting the blood, is the source of life in the body. It is there before anything else in the body, and provides the basis for the development and flourishing of the rest of the body. What about the strange language of the tutelary deity? Even more so than the sun, this image evokes something otherworldly, a spiritual guardian, a protective god. This guardian could be regional, a local god or goddess who would protect a town from invasion, or it could be personal. In either case, the deity protects part of our world and is accessible to some degree, but transcends our realm. Again, we have the sense that Harvey saw the heart as a source of life and protection, a source which was not reducible to any other activity. The heart, as the sun to our microcosm and the tutelary deity of our body, has its being from something other than ourselves. Where does the heart's ability to beat come from? Harvey might say, that question is metaphysical, akin to the question, where does life come from? It is not a question Harvey shows any hint of asking in De Motu Cordis. When Harvey looks at the heart, he sees an irreducible font of life and motion. The spontaneous and regular squeeze of heart that he discerned from his many observations and experiments would make sense to him. The heart squeezes out its beats over and over again, providing living animals with their life and their motion because, well, that's what it does. Let's turn to Descartes. For him, There is no question of otherworldliness, no metaphors of suns and deities. What we get from Descartes is clocks and robots. In the discourses, he says that people who are acquainted with automata, quote, will therefore think of this body as a machine created by the hand of God, end quote. Bodies may be incomparably better designed and with more admirable movements than any machine that can be invented by man, another quote. But still, they are machines, which is to say, systems of parts linked together to take advantage of physical laws of motion to achieve some particular sort of movement. When Descartes looks at the heart, he sees a machine whose motion will, in the end, be reducible to simple physical principles. Accordingly, the question of how the heart beats is a live question for Descartes, similar to the question of how a clock moves. In the case of the clock, in Descartes' time, gears would have been fitted together in a case, connected most likely to a tightened spring that would be wound up periodically. If Descartes sees the heart as part of a machine, one natural question would be, what sort of physical laws of motion are being used to achieve the particular motion of the heartbeat? What, in other words, is the equivalent of the tightened spring in a heart? We can begin to see, perhaps, why Descartes responded to Harvey's account of the squeezing heart with disbelief. Where, in the complicated and spontaneous squeezing of that organ, can one discern any simple physical principle? On the contrary, in Descartes' explosion of liquid blood into vaporous gas, we see a clear and distinct physical principle at work, namely, the necessary effect of heat on a liquid and the necessary effect of vapor pressure on the heart. Unlike either Harvey's account, or for that matter, Galen's sipping straw model, there is no innate capacity for motion here, no first part to live, last to die. There is only the action of heat on a liquid taking place inside a vessel that is pliable. We have the beginnings of an answer to our first question. How can two people observing the same phenomena come to such different accounts? Harvey and Descartes, both keenly intelligent observers, had different ideas of what it was they were looking at. In looking at an animal's body, Harvey thought he was looking at a mini cosmos, a metaphysical ordered whole. In the heart, he saw the sun to our microcosm, the irreducible source of life in the animal body. Descartes, however, saw animal bodies as machines, made by God, to be sure, and thus connected to the metaphysical in some way, but in themselves purely understandable as subject to simple laws of motion. In the heart, he saw just another part of the machine. We will leave our two authors in disagreement and turn to part 2, a more recent account. One might say that both of our authors have had their influence on how we think about the heart's motion. As I mentioned earlier, Harvey's basic understanding of the heartbeat has been tested and found to be sound, so that Harvey has won the historical debate over the account of the heartbeat. On the other hand, it would not be a terrible exaggeration to say that Descartes won the debate over how to view living organisms as machines rather than as microcosms. The mechanical metaphor for living things was not uncontroversial, and there have always been strong cases to be made that living things are not simply made up of parts within parts, which all obey simple physical laws, notably from Hans Driesch, whom our freshmen will read this semester. It is true, though, that any claim that a living process was irreducibly biological was always eventually met with the attempt to reduce it to a physical process. And last year, if you missed it, Daniel Nicholson gave a really good lecture, which you can find on the college archives, on the machine metaphor in biology and how it's been used. I highly recommend it. Harvey's account, to Descartes' chagrin, was accepted. Yet, as we have said, the irreducibility of the capacity for the heart to beat was called into question. We might expect that a more contemporary account of the heartbeat would have to dissect that spontaneous squeeze that took such hold over Harvey's imagination. During Harvey's lifetime, a powerful tool was invented that would aid in this quest, the microscope. If we are to see what is happening during the heartbeat, we need to look ever more closely at smaller and smaller parts, using the microscope and later other tools and theories. Since the 1600s, we have learned that animal bodies are almost always organized as cells of different types that come together with extracellular substances to form tissues, such as muscle tissue and organs, such as the heart. Studying cells eventually led us to understand better what it takes for the heart to contract. The heart is composed of what we now call cardiac muscle cells, closely linked together and able to rapidly communicate with one another. And here we have sort of the heart muscle and kind of the spiral pattern of the muscles, and then a little bit smaller version here with the fibers. And then here, even smaller, and this is the junction between two cells. And the little black circles are nuclei. Cardiac muscle cells join together end to end to form muscle fibers. The junctions are seamless, so that it's difficult to even tell where one cell begins and the other ends. So that's, yeah, whoopsie. There we go, right button. So yeah, it's kind of hard to tell, right? It looks like kind of a seamless connection. Thousands upon thousands of those fibers are then bundled together and intricately organized, comprising the distinct sections of the heart muscle that I've already mentioned, auricles and ventricles. The carefully coordinated contraction of all those cardiac muscle cells is what constitutes the heartbeat. Let's look then at how muscle contraction works at the cellular level. Cardiac muscle cells contain an ordered array of two proteins called actin and myosin. These are arranged in smaller arrays called sarcomeres, and that was the one I went to earlier. These proteins, so this is the red stuff is the actin, and the blue stuff in the middle is the myosin. The proteins are long and thin in shape, forming fibers, and they intercalate with each other in an alternating pattern. The myosin has bulbous heads that come out of the bundle of myosin fibers. So that's these little guys kind of sticking out here on either end. When unencumbered, the myosin heads bind the actin fibers and swivel, thus pulling the actin closer together. One can think of a kind of ratchet action as the bulbous head of the myosin attaches to the actin, pivots down, detaches, unbends, and then reattaches to the actin, repeating until the contraction is over. And then here is, so I'm in the 21st century. You see that? It moves. Because the myosin heads are arranged on both ends of the myosin fibers, the actin is pulled together from both sides, thus contracting the whole cell structure. Contraction of a muscle fiber and ultimately the whole muscle occurs since all of the muscle cells are connected and are able to contract in unison. And so here we can kind of see the muscle cells and their stripes. So these blacker divisions are between cells, and you can kind of see the little lighter stripes. Those are the sarcomeres, the little actin and myosins coming together. And then we'll go back to this one. In a resting state, when no contraction is happening, the place on the actin where the myosin head would bind is covered up by another protein called troponin, and that's the little yellow blobs here. Troponin prevents the myosin from binding and so prevents contraction. When the troponin is removed, the myosin is again able to bind actin and thereby start the process of contraction. In order to understand what starts a muscle cell contracting then, we will need to understand what makes the troponin go away. It turns out that the whole process depends on calcium ions. Calcium ions are like elemental calcium atoms, but they have 2 fewer electrons per ion than normal atom has, and so are positively charged. Calcium ions can bind to the troponin protein. When they do so, they prevent the troponin from binding to the actin. Therefore, all that is needed for a contraction to begin is for the cell to be flooded with calcium ions. So that's the calcium, and then there's a little calcium floating out, and the troponin kind of moves, and then you got your contraction. So in the presence of calcium ions, the myosin heads can bind to the exposed actin, beginning the whole process of contraction. All right, that's it for slides for a minute. So where do calcium ions come from, and how is it that they flood the cell to cause muscle contraction? What leads the cell to be flooded with calcium ions to trigger muscle contraction at some times and not at other times? This question turns out to be more complicated. Our chain of causes begins with something called an action potential. An action potential is what leads to the release of a flood of calcium ions into the cell cytoplasm from a cellular organelle that stores calcium. The calcium binds the troponin comes off the actin, and the myosin binds to the actin, and a contraction can begin. We now have a chain of causes which leads to the contraction of the muscle cell and which begins with an action potential. Let's look more closely at this action potential and break down the meaning of the term. Because action potentials have everything to do with the concentration of different ions in a cell, we will need to take a brief detour into electrochemistry, something our seniors will be delving into very soon. But don't worry, we will dip just a toe into these deep waters. Earlier, we defined calcium ions as calcium atoms, which have become electrically charged. Let's think about ions once again, in more detail. For our purposes, there are two things of importance about ions: their chemical identity and their charge. We'll focus first on chemical identity and then on electrical charge. A drop of any chemical that is added to a liquid solution will diffuse throughout the whole volume until its concentration is the same throughout the liquid. This happens automatically, so to speak, as long as the chemical can dissolve in the liquid and as long as the liquid remains liquid, so that the molecules of the chemical can still move. One can think about this principle of diffusion in a statistical way. Given that everything in the liquid solution flows, it is more likely for a molecule of something to go in one of the many directions that lead away from the initial drop than for it to come together in an even more dense drop. From the standpoint of chemical identity, an ion in solution will tend to diffuse until its concentration is the same everywhere in the solution. Electrical charges, on the other hand, tend to move in such a way as to lower the electrical potential, that is, to spread out and reduce any difference in electrical charge of the system they are in. When we draw out an electrical circuit, we usually notate the source of electrical potential, such as a battery, with a plus on one side and a minus on the other. The naive idea behind the notation is that electrons flow towards the positive side. As for what electron and flow could possibly mean, I will leave that for another lecture. For now, we can keep our naive view and imagine that there's a sort of attraction between positively and negatively charged entities which causes motion. From the standpoint of electrical charge, an ion in solution will tend to move towards any area that contains net charge of the opposite sign. So positive ions will tend to move towards areas of negative charge and vice versa. This has the effect of lowering the overall electrical potential of the solution. The motion of an ion in solution, so an ion which has both chemical identity and charge, will therefore be subject to both the diffusive tendency of dissolved molecules and the attractive tendency of opposite charges to move towards each other. Chemically, the ion will diffuse throughout the liquid it is in. Electrically, it will be drawn to regions of opposite charge. In practice, ions are generally found in the form of salts, compounds made up of ions of positive charge paired with ions with an equal negative charge, so that the compound is electrically neutral. For example, table salt crystals consist of arrays of positively charged sodium ions paired with negatively charged chloride ions. When dissolved in water, for instance, table salt will separate into its constituent ions. If a crystal of table salt is dropped into a bucket of water, the sodium and chloride ions will just disperse throughout the bucket, positive and negatives in equal amounts throughout, sodium and chloride in equal amounts throughout. So that's that. So far, nothing too exciting is happening. We have salt water. Things get interesting, though, when the freedom of molecular movement is constrained, for instance, by some sort of barrier, or for instance, a cellular membrane. Let's continue with our simple model by imagining a bucket full of water, but with a divider in the middle, which can let through some things, but not others. We call this divider a semi-permeable membrane. Imagine in our simple case that the membrane can let in only things below a certain size. Maybe it has tiny holes in it like a colander. Let's add some table salt to the left side of the bucket and see what happens as it dissociates into the positive and negative ions. In the case of the salt ions that are all smaller than the holes in the divider, the ions will flow freely between the sides so that in the end, both sides of the bucket will have the same concentration of salt in the water. So it looks pretty much like the first one because the holes are big. But if the holes are too small for either of the salt ions, then the left side will retain all the salt and the right side will be pure water, which I did not put a slide of. What happens if only some of the ions can cross the barrier? We added table salt, sodium chloride. The sodium ions are much smaller than the chloride ions, so let's say the sodium ions can cross the barrier while the chloride ions cannot. At first, the larger chloride ions will stay in the left side of the bucket, and the smaller sodium ions will cross over to the right side of the bucket. But recall that sodium ions are positively charged, and chloride ions are negatively charged. We will need to take electrical potential into account. At first, when the salt is put into the left side of the bucket of water, there will be equal numbers of positive and negative charges. As soon as the small sodium ions start to move to the right side, though, there will be a charge imbalance. The right side of the bucket with more sodium ions will have a net positive charge, so that's over here, while the left, having lost some of its positive charges in the form of the exiting sodium ions, will be net negative. Now the electrical effects will start to be felt, tending to bring sodium back to the left side of the bucket. So what is the sodium to do? Will it tend to move to the right, following its chemical tendency to diffuse, or to the left, following its electrical attraction? What happens is that the salt ions in the bucket will come to an equilibrium. The sodium ions will tend to move to the right side of the bucket, but not in the same amount as they would have, without the effects of the charge. We will end up with what is called a Nernst equilibrium, in which all the chlorides will be on the left, naturally, since the chloride ions can't move past the barrier, but some of the sodium ions will move to the right. The overall concentration of sodium will be skewed to the left compared to where it would have been without the barrier. This situation that results will be completely stable, with equal numbers of sodium ions moving to the left and the right at any one time, but the bucket will have a charge imbalance. The left side of the bucket will be net negative, and the right side will be net positive, and just like that, we have created a system that is at once completely stable and electrically out of balance. All we needed to create this system was a container with a semi-permeable membrane which allows only one of our two kinds of slides through. Now we're bringing it back to cells. As I alluded to earlier, cell membranes are incredibly complicated, semi-permeable membranes. Each cardiac muscle cell sets up the same sort of dynamic equilibrium between the ion concentration and the charge within the cell and outside the cell. Our cell membranes are semi-permeable membranes like the divider in our bucket. But unlike the divider, a cell membrane is riddled with extremely specific proteins which only interact with and bind to a particular kind of molecule, and these are called channels. Depending on the type of protein channel they may allow the molecule they bind to go in and out with abandon, to only go in but not out, to go in but only if another different molecule goes out. You get the idea. To add to the complexity, sometimes the channels actively bring molecules from one side of the membrane to another, in which case they are called transporters or pumps. The complexity of the cell membrane is astounding and beautiful, and we are only considering one small aspect of what it does. Consider our bucket that was in stable equilibrium but out of balance electrically. Cell membranes also have equilibrium situations in which the concentrations of ions and the charge on the inside and outside of the cell are out of balance. It turns out that this is the state of cells in general, that both the ion concentration and the overall charge are different inside the cell versus outside. Unlike our bucket, though, the cell membrane's transporters are able to move ions actively. The membrane can control what the equilibrium concentrations and potentials are, at least to some extent. Thus, the cells we are interested in will have potentials that are more extreme than the Nernst equilibrium would be, generated by the cell actively pumping ions against their concentration and charge gradients. Another difference between our bucket and the cell membranes is that the movement of ion travel across a cell membrane is more complex. While there are specific channels and transporters for ions, there is also usually some ion movement across the cell membrane itself. The membrane is not completely impervious to the ions in question, and there will always be some leakage. If the cell is actively pumping sodium ions to the outside of the cell, for example, some sodium ions will leak back across the membrane into the cell interior, thus reducing the potential and concentration gradients. When this happens, the cell pumps more sodium ions out of the interior, restoring the desired state of polarization. The constant activity of the cell to keep the inside at a certain voltage and concentration with respect to the outside means that using the term equilibrium is a little misleading. The cells are at a sort of equilibrium, but it is an active equilibrium, one that is in constant flux, with microcurrents of ions leaking in and being pumped out of the cell. The term for the situation described is steady state equilibrium. The term is meant to capture the steady work the cell is doing in order to keep itself at a constant state of unequal concentrations of ions inside versus outside. Let's spend a moment dwelling on steady state equilibrium. The living cell is constantly working to achieve a state of being in which the inside has a certain electrical potential difference with respect to the outside, and at the same time, a particular chemical concentration gradient with respect to the outside. This is not to say that there's anything like a cellular mind that decides what needs to happen to achieve the right potential and concentration, at least not that we found so far. Rather, each cell is formed such that the channels it has respond to its environment by moving ions in and out. The collective activity of the channels produces the electrical potential and chemical concentration, which in turn affect the activity of the channels. The channels and transporters typically span the whole membrane. Their rates of moving ions in one direction or another don't just depend on what is on one side of the membrane, but on the difference between the inside and the outside. All of the little proteins in the cell membrane that regulate what goes in and what goes out of the cell work within a chemical and electrical context that includes both sides of the membrane. And here, this is a space-filling model of a voltage-gated sodium channel. So this is the kind of protein that might be across a membrane. So this version is like crosswise looking through, edge on at the membrane. And then this is like from the top or the bottom. And you can kind of see, so this is closed, the little bottom gates are closed. And then this one, they're open. You can kind of see the hole in the middle opens up. And this is my cartoon version. As one example, we might think of a protein with two arms, like a little gate that has negative charges. When the inside of the cell becomes more positively charged relative to the outside, the negatively charged gate is attracted to the inside of the cell and changes conformation accordingly. So here is kind of negative, and then you get more positives here, it kind of opens them out. And then the little purple or magenta sodium ions come through. When it does this, the channel is unblocked so that ions can flow through unimpeded. Because of the way channels work, the cell is de facto comparing the concentration of ions and the charge density of the inside to the outside and working accordingly. Rather than simply taking stock of either the inside or the outside, the cell feels the difference, so to speak, between the inside and the outside. When the channel opens and ions flow through, it is effectively changing the potential difference between the inside and the outside of the cell in some small way, which will then affect its own activity. As a side note, I can't help but think that this image of the cell working constantly to achieve a steady-state equilibrium is something Aristotle would recognize as entelikeia. Mr. Sachs translates entelikeia as being at work, staying itself. In the case of membrane potential and concentration gradients, the proteins in the cell membrane respond to the difference between the inside and the outside of the cell and work to keep that difference exactly what the cell needs it to be. The cell is at work, building the relationship it has to the rest of the body, staying itself in the midst of a constant flow of ions. With this image of the cell at steady-state equilibrium in mind, we are finally equipped to think about the action potential. Recall that we had outlined a chain of causes in the contraction of a muscle cell in which calcium ions flood the cell, troponin falls off the actin, the myosin heads ratchet on and off the actin, and the cell contracts. Our chain of causes began with what I called an action potential. We will now attempt to understand this complicated event. The cell is working constantly to keep itself in steady-state equilibrium with respect to electrical potential and chemical concentration. So this graph is just about the electrical potential over time. So this first part is steady state. This is the potential, so basically just how positive the inside is with respect to the outside. And that's kind of the normal state of things for the cell. Our muscle cells have many sodium channels that are gated to respond to the potential of the cell membrane. At times, the muscle cell will experience a rise in potential so that the inside of the cell is more positively charged than the outside, than it had been before. Sorry, more positively charged than it had been before. And I'll come back to this point later. When the inside of the cell gets above a certain potential with respect to the outside, the sodium channels will open up. So you see there's a little hump here, something's starting to change a little, and then that opens up those channels that we were looking at before, and then boom, the whole, all the sodium floods in, and the inside is then much more positively charged than it used to be. So then the sodium channels open up, allowing a flood of sodium ions into the cell. This flood of positive sodium ions will increase the electrical polarization even more, which will in turn open more sodium channels. So that's partly why this curve is so steep, is that each little channel then lets in more sodium, which then opens more channels, and it's kind of a positive feedback loop, so to speak. Suddenly, the steady-state equilibrium of the cell has been lost. This spike of positive electrical potential inside the cell with respect to the outside is the action potential. This rapid change in both charge difference and chemical composition of the intracellular milieu is the event that releases the calcium ions from storage, which starts our chains of causes until we achieve contraction of the muscle cell. As you might imagine, the large flow of sodium ions into the muscle cell will not go on forever. At a certain point, the sodium concentration will equilibrate so that the sodium will be equally likely to go through the channel in either direction. But in addition, our cell goes back to work trying to stay itself. It goes into mop-up mode, madly trying to return everything to the way it was, pumping sodium out from the inside of the cell and resequestering the calcium within the cell. Soon enough, the reduced calcium allows the troponin to bind back onto the actin filaments, the myosin lets go of the actin, and the contraction stops. The cell has returned to its steady-state equilibrium. So now we're back to where we were before. This complicated setup and response happens every single time a muscle contracts in your body. As you are changing position in your chairs, as you tap your toes, as you scratch your nose, and with each and every heartbeat, action potentials are occurring. Ions are flowing in and being pumped back out again and again and again. There is a difference, though, between toe tapping and a heartbeat. The action potential has to be started by something. As I said before, at times the muscle cell will experience a rise in potential, so this little hump here that we haven't really explained yet. This initial increase in electrical potential allowed the first sodium channels to open up. How can this initial rise in potential happen if the cell is so busily working to keep itself at the steady state equilibrium? In most muscle cells, the answer lies in the coupling of motor neurons with the muscle cells. When you decide to tap your toe, motor neurons from your brain instigate this initial change in potential across the muscle cell membrane. The muscle responds with the action potential, which leads to the contraction and relaxation. So there's a kind of external influence on the cell, which leads to that first hump and makes everything happen. You may not be too conscious about tapping your toe, but some part of you is making it happen through motor neurons. The heartbeat is different. As Harvey noticed, the beat starts in the right auricle and travels from there. There is a particular part of the right auricle called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, where the contraction begins. Remember that our cardiac muscle cells are a bit leaky. As the channels and transporters are working hard to keep a certain chemical and electrical gradient, a few ions are leaking back in to the other side of the membrane, causing more work for the cardiac muscle cell transporters. It turns out that the cardiac muscle cells in the SA node are a bit leakier than most cells. While the cell is working hard to keep itself at the steady state equilibrium, the ability of some ions to leak back into the cell keeps the equilibrium from lasting very long. Slowly but surely, positive ions leak into the cell, eventually increasing the positive charge enough so that the sodium channels open. Once the gated sodium channels open, the cell is flooded with sodium ions and our action potential has begun. In other words, the cells of the SA node spontaneously and regularly contract. Once these cells contract, the cells around them in the auricles, which are tightly connected, remember this tight connection between the cells, they immediately contract also. The cells of the ventricles are connected to the auricles as well, but less tightly, so that there is a delay in the contraction of the ventricles. So these are the little nodes. This is the SA node here, and then it travels down to this atrioventricular node and goes over. So the whole heart contracts. So the extra leaky sinoatrial node cells start a general contraction of the auricles, which then travels to the rest of the heart. The ventricle muscle cells, which form a spiral band around the cavities inside, contract in a way that forces the blood out of the heart and into the body. The whole thing begins with the action potential of a few little cells in the sinoatrial node of the right auricle, and is coordinated from there around the whole heart in the two phases which we are so familiar with, the lub of the auricles and the dub of the ventricles, lub-dub. The exquisite precision of that hypnotic lub-dub is precisely choreographed muscle contraction, which at resting heart rate in adults averages 50 to 75 beats per minute, depending on age and health. That's about 3,000 to 4,500 beats for each one of you just during the course of this lecture, if I don't keep you for too much longer, that is, and I won't. We're getting close. All right, so with this more recent account, this working model of how we now understand the heartbeat, we can begin discussing part 3, living organisms, parts and wholes. When we left Harvey and Descartes, our two authors were in disagreement, both on how to understand the heart's motion and on how to understand living beings more generally. Harvey, if you remember, thought the right auricle had an innate capacity to contract, a capacity that probably could not be understood further with simple physical principles. For Harvey, the part reigns supreme. It is the part, in this case, the right auricle, that begins the whole process of the heartbeat. The part has been endowed with a capacity for motion in itself from the beginning of the living organism's existence. The rest of the living body develops around the heart and is coordinated with it. As the sun of our microcosm, the heart does its thing, and the rest of the body, like the earth in the metaphor, responds to its life-giving capacity. Descartes, on the other hand, disagreed with Harvey both in how the heart acts and in how to view a living body. For Descartes, no part of a living organism would have an innate capacity for movement. Rather, the parts of a body are intricately connected in ways that take advantage of simple physical principles. The heart gives off heat, which causes the blood to vaporize. That vapor pressure causes the expansion of the heart. Descartes does not use the language of capacities, but instead speaks of mechanical necessity. The whole body is not a microcosm, but a machine, a clock ticking away out of necessity, made up of intricately designed parts, none of which has any life-giving capacity in itself. It is only in the arrangement of the parts together that motion comes to be, in the coming together of the hot heart and the liquid blood. Now that we've gone through a detailed look at what the heartbeat is, with the benefit of all the years of study since the time of Harvey and Descartes, what can we say about how the heart acts and how to view the living body? To summarize the account I've just laid out, we have a few cells in the sinoatrial node busily working to keep the chemical and electrical difference between the inside and the outside at a steady state equilibrium. They are doomed to failure by their own leakiness, so that after a certain amount of time, the inside gets a little too positively charged, which leads to the sodium channels opening up to begin the action potential. This leads to the release of calcium and the contraction of the cells, and soon thereafter of the whole heart. In the details of how the heart beats, as we've said, our account agrees with Harvey. A contraction of the heart forces blood out of the heart into the rest of the body. It does not agree with Descartes' account. There is no vaporization of the blood, no controlled explosions. The squeeze heartbeat wins the day, and the explosive heartbeat goes down in defeat. But what about a more general view of living things? Do we see something like Harvey's ruling part with an innate capacity that lends movement to the whole body? Do we see something like Descartes' machine with parts that are arranged together using simple physical principles? How are we to think about living things? I will not pretend to have an easy answer to this last question, but I will venture to make 6 observations, which I hope will be helpful. Observation number 1, we have found physical and chemical principles at work everywhere. The Cartesian push to get underneath whatever we might call a living capacity has been wildly successful. We learned about ions. We discussed electrical potential and chemical diffusion. One thing we did not do was stop and say, here is a biological capacity that I have tried and failed to understand through physical and chemical principles. I can go no further. Observation number 2. Nonetheless, different cells do have different capacities because of how they are formed. Our account singled out a few cells in the sinoatrial node as special. Although we found physical and chemical principles at work, they were not at work in some general and necessary way in the way Descartes envisioned. On the contrary, our SA node cells were in specific contrast with other heart cells, and especially to other muscle cells, in being exceptionally leaky. The work to sustain the chemical and electrical gradient is undermined in these cells because of their specific form, including the composition of their cell membranes, the kinds of protein channels and transporters therein, how rapidly they transport ions, etc. The fact of the matter is that these particular cells have what can appropriately be called a capacity to contract spontaneously, without any external cause prompting an action potential. However thoroughly we describe the physics and chemistry of their contraction, we should never lose sight of that astonishing fact. Observation number 3. Some of the parts do seem to act like little machines, others don't. The actin and myosin in particular have a fairly straightforward physical activity, one which we described as a ratchet, a word derived from machines and quite apt. The pivot action of the myosin head moves physically like something one might see in a factory. The ion channels also seem machine-like, with a gate that opens to let ions go through when the potential rises high enough. On the other hand, the cell looks less machine-like and more responsive, more alive, for want of a better term. Why is this? One thing we noticed earlier is the cell's effort to keep itself in a steady state equilibrium, what we described as a sort of Aristotelian entelechy. This effort requires the ion channels and transporters, the membrane itself, and importantly, the environment in which the cell finds itself. The steady-state equilibrium takes into account the whole cell plus its immediate environment. One big difference between the machine-like actin and myosin bundles and ion channels on the one hand, and the cell plus immediate environment on the other hand, is the clarity with which we can identify a part. The former examples have very distinct parts, the latter much less so. In what sense can we call the immediate environment of the cell a part of anything? And yet, the environment of ions is absolutely essential in understanding the action of the cell. Observation number 4. The cells create their own environment, which they then respond to. One hallmark of both Harvey's and Descartes' accounts of the relationship between the part of the living body and the whole body is the primacy of the part. For Harvey, the heart is the first part to live, the last to die. The rest of the body forms around it. The metaphorical phrases, the sun to our microcosm and the tutelary deity of the body, emphasize the ruling power of the heart. For Descartes, it is unclear what sort of ontological status the whole body has, beyond being the result of the careful arrangement of physical and chemical parts. In his account, it looks like the individual actions of each part taken together add up to the action of the whole. What we see in our more recent account, however, is mutual causation between the parts and the whole. The cell has a semi-permeable membrane which separates the inside from the outside. The activity of the cell, that is, whether it contracts or not, is based on the electrical potential across that membrane. Electrical potential is not a thing in itself. It is a comparison between the two sides of the membrane. That potential is generated by the activity of many channels and transporters across the whole cell. That potential also affects the activity of those same channels and transporters. When the potential gets to a certain point, some closed channels open up. The parts of the cell each have a small role in creating the context in which the cell finds itself. That context then changes how the parts of the cell behave. The parts affect the whole cell and its environment, which in turn affect the parts. We have only looked at a tiny part of the story, and even that tiny part has been oversimplified in many ways. The heartbeat is affected by diet, emotions, activity level, and hormones, just to name a few things, all of which come from the body as a whole. The principle that the parts of a living being affect the whole organism, which then in turn affects those same parts, applies in all biological systems of all living things. It is safe to say that this principle is a hallmark of living things. Neither Harvey nor Descartes pay much attention to the idea of mutual causation, though Harvey at least has an idea of a mini-cosmos, an ordered whole, with its own integrity. For Descartes, it seems that the parts are simply causative, and the whole body is not. Observation number 5. Form is critical at all levels. We've already commented on the form of the cells in the sinoatrial node and how important it is that those cells have especially leaky membranes. Both Harvey and Descartes noticed the importance of form, but perhaps even they would be astounded at just how pervasive it turns out to be. Here are some more instances of the importance of form in our more recent account of the heart. The form of the gated channels is key to their sensitivity to electrical potential. If the gate isn't shaped, situated, or charged properly, it will not open at the right time, if ever. The form of the ions is critical for them to be able to travel across the membrane, either directly or using channels or transporters. Ions and atoms have something analogous to shape. This shape is essential to their ability to perform the interactions I've described. Cardiac cells are aligned in cardiac muscle fibers, which are formed in a spiral pattern so that upon contraction they close up the interior of the heart and force the blood out. The blood flows through the artery and veins that are just the right shape, size, and consistency to keep the blood flowing to where it needs to go. There's more, but that's what I'll stop with those. Observation number 6. This final observation is really a question. How did it all come to be? I don't mean all life on Earth, which is an excellent question in itself. I mean any one particular living body. As we learned from Driesch, every higher organism came from one undifferentiated cell that divided many times. At each division, some of the cells differentiate into other types of tissue. In animals, at some point very early on, the heart tissue develops. How do those cells form correctly? How do those unique sinoatrial node cells form differently from the other cardiac muscle cells? How do they grow together just right with the rest of the auricles? We are only just beginning to learn some of the details that might help us with these questions. Conclusion. Parts and wholes in the living body have been on my mind, but I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts on how parts and wholes function in our community of learning. You have all had at least one class this year, and so you've had some experience at being in a classroom conversation at St. John's. At what level should we look for wholeness in our discussions? In a seminar? In a year? In a lifetime? To what extent are our conversations wholes made up of individual parts? To what extent should we aim at making a conversation whole when it seems like it isn't coming together? How does each individual's voice contribute to the whole conversation? How does the whole conversation affect each person's thoughts and voice? How does a single voice fit together with other voices around the table? When does the voice of one member drive the whole conversation, the sun which gives life to the discussion? When does the conversation feel mechanical, as if you're just saying what needs to be said out of necessity? When does the conversation feel alive, as if each individual is being truly affected by the whole conversation? There are times when each of these modes is appropriate, when the voices fit together well, or when the fit is awkward, when one voice is dominant for a bit, when people say what needs to be said, because it needs to be said. I hope and expect, though, that as this academic year develops, we will all have the regular experience of conversations that are alive, where each person in the room, each part of our community, contributes to a whole that affects us each in turn. Thank you.